Right, well, good evening and welcome to our evening service. Anyone that's new, welcome, and oh yeah, please come on in. So for our evening service, what we basically do is we have a time together of fellowship over tea and coffee with worship music in the background. Then we come in here and we're working through a series called Walk Through the Bible. And for this series, we are just basically working through the different books of the Bible and giving an overview of them. Some of the longer books will take a couple of weeks, some of the shorter ones will be a week. And today we're going to be looking at 2 Thessalonians. The sheet that you have in front of you, this is just a helpful overview from the Bible Project, which provides a good structure of where the book is going. What I'll be doing is I'll be picking out that structure, but then maybe then focusing in some of the slightly more curious or interesting parts of the book. Last week we were looking at 1 Thessalonians and that straight away in such a short letter had so many really interesting things that we're able to discuss, particularly around the idea of end times. And as we go into 2 Thessalonians, we're going to be going back into that subject as Paul delves into that subject again as he's writing to the church there. So a few sort of like fast facts, just to get us to root ourselves and understand where we're coming from. So the letter of 2 Thessalonians, it's another early bird letter, one of the earliest manuscripts that we actually have in terms of the New Testament. It was believed that it was written around mid-50 AD, and this is when Paul was most likely in his second missionary journey. And it's believed that it was written shortly after 1 Thessalonians. I mean, certainly it seems to be that Paul is writing back and referring to many of the subjects that he'd raised in the letter before. It's written or has largely been attributed as Pauline authorship. The reason why I say it like that is that at the beginning Paul says that the letter's from him and his companions. And so it represents the ministry team who are writing a letter to this church that they'd effectively planted. It follows the Pauline style, and yet there has been a bit of debate around in modern sort of like times if they think that it was actually directly penned by Paul, because some of the themes in it and the language that it uses they think is a little bit different to some of the other letters that we know come from Paul. However, since the early tradition, it has been largely accepted as Paul's writing. And when I was looking into it, it was quite interesting because somebody used the example of Charles Wesley's songs and how in some of his songs he's writing in a certain style which is very distinctive for him, and in others he seems to have been switching into more of a apocalyptic and symbolical and metaphorical sort of like style. And so there's a suggestion that really, should it be that unexpected that Paul might actually use different styles as he's writing to these different audiences and dealing with different issues. It's very short. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend that you do have a read of it because it won't take you long to get through at all. It's actually Paul's second shortest letter that we have after Philemon, which was addressed to an individual. So here we have a really short and quite concise letter which was written to the church at Thessalonica. The main themes that we have in his letter are hope and judgment, the day of the Lord, particularly the introduction of this idea of the man of lawlessness, which we'll come into a bit later. And then he writes at the end about idleness. Something which has been suggested is that Paul seems a bit moody in this letter here, that he's not seeming to be writing with the same sort of like warmth that he did in the previous letter. Maybe a suggestion that he's a little bit more upset in this letter. And yet, if you look at the thanksgivings and the prayers, you can get a sense of Paul's deep affection for the church here. But there are a couple of issues that he's writing into. And if we think of these issues in context of the first letter, it does seem to be that he's writing back again regarding some of these issues which he'd covered earlier. And we do get that, as he seems to be a little bit sharper in trying to address these issues. The two issues are particularly that the church there seems to be being thrown into confusion by somebody that is declaring within the authority of Paul that the day of the Lord was upon them now. And then the second one is that it seems to be that he's hearing reports that there are still people who are maybe being idle or maybe being disruptive, maybe not living the life that he really feels that they're called to. And so he's addressing these two issues. The key verse, I would say, for this book, which is actually the most popular verse in 2 Thessalonians, and actually quite high in the rankings of popular verses in general, is "Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes back and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction." And this is in chapter 2 and verse 3. And as we dive deeper into this, I think you'll see why this is such a popular verse, because it does create a lot of interesting discussion and a lot of different views on exactly what it is and who it is that Paul is speaking about here. So we're going to make our way through the letter in 3 sections based on the overall themes of hope and judgment in the midst of persecution, some more clarity on this coming day of the Lord, and then this final challenge that Paul gave regarding idleness. And I'm going to kind of intentionally go through the first and the last quite quickly, because the day of the Lord is where we really get into something which has had a lot more speculation, and there's a much wider spectrum of sort of like views over exactly what Paul was saying here. So the first chapter is very much looking at this idea of hope and judgment within Jesus's followers. It's suggesting that Jesus will bring justice to bear on those people that are oppressing them. And this was quite important, because as we saw in 1 Thessalonians, there was a real threat of persecution for the church there. In fact, I'd explain that at the in Acts, we get a bit of context into Paul's missionary journey to that church in Thessalonica. And if you remember, it was really amazing, because Paul, he'd gone in and he'd been expressing and pronouncing the good news of Christ, and it had been so readily accepted. But at the same time, those that were opposed to this message reacted quite forcefully. And these people went to the house where Paul was staying and where he was being hosted, and they arrested the host. And as they arrested the host, it was the brothers of the host that had snuck Paul out of this house in order to allow him to be safe. And this kind of like gives a bit of a context here, because Paul is writing into a very real situation where these early followers of Jesus have this backdrop of a very real risk of threat to their lives, of persecution. And yet here, Paul is saying to them that despite the challenges that you face now, the uncertainty of the time that you are in, he says that Jesus will bring justice to bear on those who have oppressed him. And he doesn't go into a lot of detail about what this justice will actually entail. But he does highlight some sort of consequence for people who reject God. And in one of his passages here, which you see here on the screen, which is in chapter 1, verses 8 to 9, we actually have one of the most clearest and succinct explanations of this sense of punishment or justice. It's not using metaphorical descriptions. Instead, he's just written this very succinct statement where he says that inflicting vengeance of those who do not know God and of those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. He then says they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. This sentence here, it's very clear that it's suggesting that separating from Jesus is embracing our own undoing. That there's very much a correlation here between this idea of obeying Jesus and this idea of what is described as eternal destruction. And this passage has been used quite a lot in the wider sort of like framework of trying to understand exactly what is this eternal destruction. However, it is very short, it's very succinct, and Paul doesn't actually provide much more detail other than this. And in many respects, it raises this question of eternal destruction, but it doesn't go into that depth of what actually it is about. And so it almost often for people raises more questions than what it gives answers. Like just one, for example, is that it doesn't talk anything in this passage about the idea of conscious punishment, which is obviously a big thing when people are considering within that theme. The point is that Paul isn't writing this as some sort of like warning towards the oppressors. He was writing this to give hope to the Christians who were facing persecution. Hope to them that within the midst of what's happening, that Jesus will bring justice. And then he sort of like leads on from this and goes into a bit more detail into this idea of the coming of the Lord. And this is really interesting. So chapter 2 covers this predominantly because what it is showing is that the context is that there seems to be that there was somebody within the community who was spreading a falsity, but suggesting that they were doing it under the authority of Paul. And that this seemed to have been that this was causing genuine stress within the community. This person was saying that the day of the Lord was here. And that as people were then thinking about that, you sort of like leading to logical conclusions, you'll be thinking about, well, would they have been thinking as God abandoned them to the suffering that they were in at that place? Was what they were going through some sort of tribulation which God had put on them because of all that they had done? And this frustrated Paul, and you get this sense of Paul's frustration here in the letter, because he said clearly in his first letter that the return of the Lord shouldn't inspire fear. The return of the Lord should be about providing and inspiring hope and confidence. But as Paul is speaking into this, he's saying to them that he wants them to remember everything that he's taught them about it, to hold on to what he's already shared with them, both in word and in letter. And here we are at a bit of a serious disadvantage because Paul is assuming that the church there are bringing into context everything which Paul has already said. He actually said in chapter 2, verse 5, "Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things?" And so again, we have a bit of detective work that then has to be made within this passage, which means that we need to try to sort of like dig and get to the bottom of what exactly Paul is meaning when he's actually then going on to speak about some quite big concepts, but he doesn't give much explanation to help reduce any confusion that people might have around these concepts. Perhaps the two most striking things that he's raised here, which seem to be adding extra detail to what he had raised in the letter in the First Thessalonians was, firstly, he mentions about a person called the man of lawlessness. And he actually talks about how this man of lawlessness is being restrained. He says in regarding the man of lawlessness in chapter 2, verses 3 to 4, he says, "Let no one deceive you in any way. For he says, for that day will not come until the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." And this is quite curious, because in the previous letter, Paul was saying that we don't know when Jesus is going to come. He's going to be like a thief in the night, and you're not going to be able to predict this. And then here, Paul seems to be outlining some quite clear information which people can use as a sign to recognize when Jesus is actually coming. And if we take this in the wider context of the scriptures, and particularly the Old Testament and Jesus' teaching, I think we can begin to get a sense where Paul is actually leaning on in terms of his understanding of the coming of the day of the Lord, and of course we would assume inspiration as well. It seems to be that Paul considers that history will continue to repeat itself, which we see today with leaders who exhort themselves to a level of divine authority. And in doing that, they sow seeds of destruction. And we've seen that pattern. And this is the same pattern which we'll see a bit later, which is identified within the Old Testament. But for Paul, this pattern, it seems to be, is going to ultimately culminate in a totally rebellious ruler. One who is empowered by evil itself, who will wreak violence and havoc on the world. And this evil ruler, the name which is often used for this man of lawlessness, is the Antichrist. That is often the name used in this context. And Paul is suggesting that Jesus will return and confront this evil and deliver his people. Well, this is not unique to Paul. And you'll see that he's actually leaning very heavily on the Old Testament, particularly on the books of Isaiah and Daniel, and actually what Jesus has said as well himself. And we'll see this if we look at Jesus' own words in Matthew chapter 24. And then I've just juxtaposed Daniel into it when he mentions the prophet Daniel. And you'll see within this, hopefully quite clearly, how what Paul is writing bears quite a lot of resemblance to his. So this is what Jesus said. He said, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, who said, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all." Jesus said, "Then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect." Hopefully you can see how what Paul was writing was actually quite foundationed with the Old Testament and what Jesus had said here. And Origen, one of the early church fathers, which I find is always quite interesting to look back at what they'd said, because they were often dealing with these issues whilst they were still quite fresh. He said that disputes about such things have existed in the church since the very beginning. And he said that for him, the figure of the Antichrist represents the extreme of evil, just as Jesus represents the fullness of goodness. But then, who is this figure? I'm sure you can imagine there's a lot of speculation over exactly who this may be. Well, maybe some have suggested that Paul was considering a figure from that time, because we often find that when you look at even a lot of the apocalyptic literature, that you can actually see a parallel with events which were happening at the time, even if sometimes they're also speaking to things into the future. And some have suggested that maybe Paul was considering the Emperor Gaius Caligula, who, I'm sure I just said that wrong, but if I say it confidently, that sounds like that's the right way to say that, who he had raised himself to such a level of divine authority, or trying to present that he sent his soldiers to erect an image of himself in the Jerusalem temple. However, the dating of that was a bit before the letter that we have here. So if he was talking about that, he was talking about something in the past. And what we actually learn is this emperor, he actually died before this image had been installed in the temple. So maybe he was talking about him, maybe he wasn't, maybe more likely that he wasn't. Others suggest that it is a yet unknown person. This person hasn't been revealed yet. Somebody that is going to seek to exalt themselves above others and above God. Some believe that this man of lawlessness may be Satan himself, but then he's mentioned, Satan is, as a separate figure within that chapter, and it seems to be the writings are suggesting that this figure is some sort of a human figure, or a figure that we can relate to more than someone such as Satan. Interestingly, others have suggested that it's a nation state, that it's actually talking about a nation which is coming to this point of rebellion. Some looked back and were suggesting that some might have thought that it was the Roman Empire. But again, we'll see that that seems to be in contradiction to how others were interpreting it at that time. And the imagery, again, certainly seems to be pointing to an individual rather than this concept of a whole nation or a state. And then, as often is the case, others feel that it's symbolic representation of the forces of evil. Representation that this man of lawlessness is this idea of when evil is at its worst. And that at that point, Jesus would then come down. And then what's really interesting is that it introduces this idea of restraint, but it also indicates that God, having an understanding of the future events, that he also recognizes that this man is currently being restrained. It suggests that he has not appeared yet. We see this in chapter 2, verse 6 to 7. It says, "You know what is restraining him, so that he may be revealed in his time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work." So you can see how these two things, which Paul doesn't provide any real explanation or further descriptions, have created so much speculation. So as with the man of lawlessness, there's several different themes which have come up over the years. Interestingly, a lot of the early church fathers actually seem to consider that when it was talking about this what was restraining them, that it was actually by the Roman Empire. And for them, that this was less talking about an individual, but more about this sense of the Roman Empire restraining this evil. In many respects, it's kind of this idea of a lesser of two evils. We see that in some of the church fathers like Tertullian, Chrysostom, and Cyril of Jerusalem have all talked about this idea of this restrainer as the Roman Empire. Now that's quite fascinating when we look back and way past the Roman Empire and see how they were actually dealing with the passage at the time. Others have suggested that it could be Satan restraining this man of lawlessness himself until the time that he feels that he wants to reveal him. Others feel that it could be the angel of God. And this is a bit of a more modern perspective, and it's based by looking back at Daniel, particularly in chapter 11, where it says that the archangel Michael would arise prior to the deliverance of God's people. And so they're using that passage to sort of like make that connection there as well. And then finally, which seems to be the more widely accepted explanation, people have suggested that it is God that is restraining the man of lawlessness, especially in the person of the Holy Spirit. And in this, it makes you wonder whether if we take it in that context, then we might see something of God's timing within all of this. As he says, you know what is restraining him now, so that he may be revealed in his time. And you can see why people would maybe feel that it's overall talking about God, which is making this restraint. Now, it's all quite crazy, really. And I think sometimes when you delve into these passages, you get into the passages where they're really challenging, and they definitely seem to venture into what many people would think of like the weird and wonderful, or the not so wonderful at all. And it does create for really interesting discussions and speculation. However, I think it's quite important for us as we're considering these sort of like passages, and even if we've just had a really short overview of how these might be interpreted, these key forces, is to think about, well, what is it that Paul is actually saying here? Because he wasn't writing these for people to then go and have massive debates over. Clearly, people were concerned about the return of Jesus, and this was something which Paul wanted to speak into them, to give them hope and to give them encouragement. He said in 1 Thessalonians that no one knows when Jesus is coming. And we've got to assume that he's not suggesting that suddenly that is no longer the case. We're still working under that presumption. He seems to be suggesting that they shouldn't be afraid, because when he does come, which you won't know when he's coming, you will know it when he has. There's going to be no confusion over this. And I think it's really helpful to think about it in that sort of clarity. Because what Paul is describing here is these events are really public and obvious. He says, you do not need to be scared that whether you have been abandoned. Instead, that you should stay faithful in hope, because that time hasn't come yet. And when it will, you will know. Because whatever is being described, whoever the man of lawlessness is, somebody that is representing the totality of evil, we're not going to miss. There's not going to be debates over that. Augustine, one of the early church fathers, said, not to know the exact time of the Lord's coming in no way detracts from the commandment to be ready with lamps burning. He says the important thing is not to know the time of his coming, but to be ready when he does come. He says attempts to pinpoint the identity of the Antichrist are quite presumptuous. Athanasius, another early church father, he said the word has concealed both the end of all things and the time of our death from us. This is so that when things remain uncertain and always prospect, we advance day by day as if summoned. I really like that, because they're really capturing this sense of the importance of sometimes a bit of uncertainty is okay, because within that uncertainty, we need to be advancing each day with a sure feeling of response in, and the priority of that response to God's calling upon our lives. And it's within that context there that we then begin to talk about Paul begins to go into this subject of laziness. And I'll just skip through several themes here, or not laziness, idleness. And it's quite interesting that he orders the letter in this order, because here he then writes in chapter 3 a fairly short admonishment, it seems to be, on people there in the church of Thessalonica, who he felt that they weren't just being lazy, they were being irresponsible. That it seemed to be that some of them might have been refusing to work, others were working in ways which weren't giving or projecting the image that was worthy of somebody who is a follower of Christ. And he actually addressed this in the first letter, and it seems to have gotten worse. And we're not exactly sure what the reason is for this. It may be related to this whole speculation over, well, what time are we living in? So what should we actually be doing in the day-to-day? But it also might be related to the concept of the Roman concept of patronage, where poorer people lived off of the wealthy by performing services to them. And that this would often force them to deal with indifferent practices within that society, some of which might be morally corrupt practices. And again, it's clear exactly what Paul is speaking into. Maybe speaking into all of that. Maybe he's saying that each of you have an individual responsibility in the way that you live your life, because in your reflection of the way you live your life is that sense of your calling to Jesus Christ. You know, it's a witness out there, but it's also a heart issue as well, because it's about an individual's sanctification as they actually be obedient to God and allow that transformation to happen inside them. And he's challenging these people to imitate Christ's self-giving love that doesn't depend on others. For a very short letter, it has a lot in it, doesn't it? Or certainly has a lot that can require or create a lot of speculation. And I've just realised quite a longer talk than normal. The letter is clear that the early Christian belief in Christ's return and the hope of final justice, they weren't necessarily meant to produce apocalyptic speculation. Rather, Paul wrote this letter to bring hope and to inspire faithfulness and devotion to Jesus in these early followers of Jesus. And especially when they were facing persecution and uncertainty and in ways which we wouldn't ever understand. And this term holiness has actually been quite an important term which we see in the letters of Thessalonians, because it seems to be that Paul is suggesting that it expresses something which God wants to bring out in his people. And this sort of like holiness, which is then a witness, which he talks about in the first Thessalonians, is based on their faithfulness, their love, and their hope in Jesus. A good way of summing it up that I came across said, what you hope for shapes what you live for. And isn't this a really good description of what Paul was actually writing to the people there in Thessalonica? So a few questions as we go into a time of discussions. The first question is, can we make any sense of this? And what I mean is, there is a lot within that passage which we do not understand. Can we make sense of it? Are we called to make sense of it? I think it's worth sometimes to think about that. Is this letter reassuring to us today? How might we think about this letter in our context and how it can talk to us in a time which is so different to what Paul was writing into? How might we find hope in Jesus' coming rather than getting caught up in the details of apocalyptic imagery and symbolism and so on? And then finally, I thought it would be quite interesting, what would Paul say about our idleness today? So there we go. Open up with any questions, whoever's brave enough to start. And just for those that haven't been here before, this isn't a chance for you to ask me a question and I know all the answers. This is really a chance for us just to start expressing questions on this text. Other people are welcome to add to somebody's question or provide their own sort of like insight into that. And I think it's quite important for texts like this, because there is a lot of different ways that people view them, and even perhaps in this room we might see a bit of a spectrum on how people would approach some of these issues. All right, if you're okay stopping the recording, that would be great.